Now let's move into maternal and genetic considerations. Certain groups are at higher risk in pregnancy, and that includes women exposed to environmental toxins, those who use alcohol, drugs, or certain medications, and those with poor nutrition. Maternal age plays a role as well, with increased risk in very young mothers and those older than 35. Once the mother is over 40, the risk for chromosomal problems rises significantly. Another factor is consanguinity, or parents being closely related, which raises the likelihood of inherited conditions. Ethnic background also matters. Sickle cell disease is more common in African American families, Tay-Sachs disease is most common among Ashkenazi Jewish families, and thalassemia is seen most often in those of Mediterranean descent. Chromosomal alterations are another high-yield topic. Down syndrome, also called trisomy 21, is characterized by distinct facial features, low muscle tone, a single transverse crease across the palm, and varying degrees of intellectual delay. Turner syndrome occurs when a female has only one X chromosome. These individuals tend to be short in stature, have fibrous ovaries leading to infertility, and may have perceptual challenges, though intelligence is typically normal. Klinefelter syndrome happens in males who have two X chromosomes and one Y chromosome. They often experience infertility and may have mild intellectual delay. Understanding inheritance patterns is also testable. Autosomal dominant conditions, where only one affected parent is needed, carry a 50% chance of being passed on. Examples include BRCA1 and 2 gene mutations, type 2 diabetes, Marfan syndrome, and polycystic kidney disease. Autosomal recessive conditions require both parents to be carriers, and examples include cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease. Sex-linked inheritance, most often X-linked recessive, includes hemophilia and colorblindness, which primarily affect males. Inborn errors of metabolism are also fair game on exams. Phenylketonuria, or PKU, occurs when the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase is missing, leading to toxic accumulation of phenylalanine in the brain. Tay-Sachs disease results from a deficiency of hexosaminidase A, which leads to progressive neurologic decline. Cystic fibrosis is caused by exocrine dysfunction and produces thick mucus that damages the lungs and pancreas. The big takeaway here is that enzyme deficiencies lead to toxic accumulation in the body, which explains the clinical symptoms. Environmental and maternal factors overlap with the genetic risks we just discussed. Smoking, alcohol, recreational drugs, toxins such as lead and mercury, and maternal diseases like diabetes and hypertension all place the pregnancy at risk. Extremes of age add to the challenge. Prevention is the mainstay of nursing care in these cases. Diagnostics during pregnancy are another high-yield group. Alpha-fetoprotein testing, done between 16 and 18 weeks, can help predict neural tube defects, threatened abortion, or fetal distress. Low alpha-fetoprotein levels may suggest Down syndrome, but keep in mind there are many false positives. Chorionic villus sampling is performed between 8 and 12 weeks to provide an early karyotype. It can diagnose conditions like sickle cell disease, PKU, Down syndrome, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The risks include bleeding, spontaneous abortion, rupture of membranes, and Rh isoimmunization. It is done with a full bladder under ultrasound guidance, and Rho-D immune globulin is given if the mother is Rh negative. Amniocentesis is usually performed around 16 weeks for genetic diagnosis and later, around 30 weeks, to assess lung maturity using the lecithin to sphingomyelin ratio. Risks include preterm labor, infection, Rh isoimmunization, placental abruption, and even amniotic embolism. After the procedure, fetal heart rate monitoring is essential, and the mother should report decreased fetal movement, contractions, abdominal pain, leaking fluid, or fever. Again, Rho-D immune globulin is given if the mother is Rh negative. Ultrasound is widely used to confirm pregnancy, estimate gestational age, determine fetal position, number, and size. A full bladder improves visualization. Non-stress testing after 28 weeks is reactive if there are 2 accelerations of at least 15 beats per minute, lasting 15 seconds within 20 minutes. Contraction stress testing after 28 weeks is positive if late decelerations appear in at least half of the contractions, and negative if there are no late decelerations in 3 contractions within 10 minutes. The mother is monitored for labor afterward. Estriol levels, measured by serial 24-hour urine or blood tests, should normally remain stable. Falling levels suggest fetal distress. Infections and hazards are another area that NCLEX loves. Urinary tract infections are more likely during pregnancy and must be treated early, often with medications such as sulfa drugs or ampicillin. The torch group includes toxoplasmosis, other infections such as syphilis, rubella, cytomegalovirus, and herpes simplex type 2. With toxoplasmosis, prevention means avoiding undercooked meat and cat litter. Syphilis should be screened for and treated with penicillin to prevent fetal transmission. Rubella is tested during pregnancy, and women are advised to avoid exposure. Vaccination is given after pregnancy if needed. Cytomegalovirus spreads through body fluids, so hand hygiene is critical. Herpes simplex type 2 requires caution. Active lesions at the time of labor means cesarean delivery is recommended. Human immunodeficiency virus should be screened for early in pregnancy, and antiretroviral therapy significantly reduces transmission. There are also high-yield danger signs in pregnancy that must be reported immediately. These include rupture of membranes or vaginal bleeding, regular contractions before term, severe headache, visual disturbances, abdominal pain, persistent vomiting, fever or chills, swelling of the face or fingers, and decreased fetal movement. Labor onset shows up with lightning, which is when the baby drops lower into the pelvis. This can happen up to 2 weeks before labor in first-time mothers or right at labor for multiparous women. Cervical softening, loss of the mucus plug, and regular contractions follow. Rupture of membranes should always be followed by immediate assessment of the fetal heart rate. A prolapsed cord is a high-yield emergency. In this case, the presenting part must be lifted off the cord, the mother placed in Trendelenburg or knee chest position, oxygen administered, intravenous fluid started, and help called right away. Fetal monitoring focuses on the fetal heart rate patterns. The normal baseline is between 120 and 160 beats per minute. Tachycardia is defined as more than 160 for longer than 10 minutes, while bradycardia is less than 110 for longer than 10 minutes. Normal variability is 6 to 25 beats per minute. Variability of 0 to 2 beats per minute is absent, 3 to 5 beats per minute is decreased, and more than 25 beats per minute is increased. Accelerations are reassuring. Early decelerations mirror contractions and are benign, usually from head compression. Late decelerations occur after contractions and are caused by uteroplacental insufficiency. Variable decelerations are abrupt drops shaped like U's or V's and are caused by cord compression. The rule of thumb for NCLEX is this: late decelerations point to placenta problems, while variable decelerations point to cord problems. Interventions for abnormal fetal heart rate patterns include turning the mother onto her left side first, then other side-lying positions, or into Trendelenburg or knee chest if needed. Oxygen should be given, intravenous fluids increased, oxytocin stopped, and preparation made for cesarean delivery if the pattern does not resolve. Variable decelerations often improve with maternal repositioning or a hands and knees position. The mechanics of labor include all the elements we reviewed earlier: the fetal lie, which is usually longitudinal, the presentation, which is vertex in about 95% of cases, but can also be breech or shoulder, the attitude, which is usually flexion, and the position, which can be left or right occiput anterior, posterior, or sacrum anterior, depending on presentation. Pelvic shape, uterine distensibility, and station at the ischial spines also influence labor. Contractions must be monitored closely, especially if they are closer than 2 minutes apart or lasting longer than 90 seconds. Intensity is described as mild, moderate, or strong. Distinguishing true from false labor is crucial, and understanding the 4 stages of labor: latent, active, and transition in the first stage, the 3 phases of the second stage, followed by delivery of the placenta, and the immediate 4 hours postpartum, helps guide care. Cultural practices, such as silence in Japanese labor or squatting in Laos, also influence support during labor. Fetal progress and distress are always monitored with fetal heart rate checks. If the heart rate is irregular, the nurse should reposition the mother onto her left side, provide oxygen, check for a prolapsed cord, and start intravenous fluids. In the event of cord prolapse, the presenting part must be elevated, the mother placed in Trendelenburg or knee chest, oxygen and fluids given, and emergency help called immediately. Managing labor pain and anesthesia includes both non-drug and drug measures. Non-drug methods include relaxation, breathing, sacral massage, rest between contractions, and keeping parents informed. Analgesics must be timed to the stage of labor and the condition of the fetus, since they can prolong labor. Systemic opioids like morphine carry a risk of maternal and fetal respiratory depression. Butorphanol and nalbuphine, which are agonist-antagonists, cause less depression. Local anesthetics can be used for episiotomy. Pudendal blocks are sometimes used for operative vaginal deliveries. Spinal anesthesia, placed between lumbar 3 and lumbar 5, is used for cesarean birth but carries risks such as maternal hypotension, respiratory depression, fetal distress, and post-dural puncture headache. Epidurals placed between lumbar 4 and lumbar 5 are the most common form of anesthesia in labor and may use medications such as bupivacaine, ropivacaine, fentanyl, or sufentanil. Some systems even allow patient-controlled epidural administration. Combined spinal epidural anesthesia begins with an opioid followed by a local anesthetic. Regardless of the type, the nurse must always be alert for maternal hypotension, which is the most common complication of neuraxial anesthesia. Preparation for delivery includes ensuring all equipment is ready for a normal spontaneous vaginal delivery and being prepared for complications in the case of a vaginal birth after cesarean. At birth, priorities are clear. Establish an airway, assign APGAR scores at 1 and 5 minutes, clamp the cord, maintain warmth, and apply identification bands. Airway and temperature are the very first concerns. Postpartum care during the first 1 to 2 hours is critical. Blood pressure and pulse should be checked every 15 minutes until stable. The fundus should be checked every 15 minutes as well, starting at the level of the umbilicus for the first 12 hours, and then descending 1 finger breath each day until it returns to the pelvis by about day 10. Lochia should be monitored closely. Rubra, which is red and bloody, occurs on days 1 to 3. Serosa, which is pink or brown, from days 4 to 9. And alba, which is yellow or white, from day 10 onward. Lochia should never have a foul odor, as this indicates infection. The first void should be assessed for retention or urethral swelling. Bonding should be encouraged through touch, eye contact, and naming the baby. Signs of postpartum infection include foul-smelling lochia or perineal redness, swelling, or discharge. These should be reported immediately so that antibiotics can be started. Rho-D immune globulin should be given to Rh-negative mothers who deliver an Rh-positive infant. Breastfeeding requires support. Mothers should be taught about the letdown reflex, nipple care with warm water instead of soap, air drying, applying breast milk to the nipple, and using warm compresses after feeds. A good latch means the baby's mouth covers a large portion of the areola, and suction should be broken with a finger before removal. Rotating positions helps reduce soreness. For mothers who do not plan to breastfeed, lactation suppression is encouraged with a tight bra for 72 hours, ice packs, and minimal stimulation. Engorgement is managed with frequent nursing, emptying the breasts completely, applying warmth before feeding, and using ice and mild analgesics as needed. Plug ducts respond to heat and massage. Milk can be expressed manually or with a pump, stored in the refrigerator for up to 4 days, frozen ideally for 6 months, or up to 12 months if necessary. Thawed milk should never be refrozen. Medications should always be reviewed with the provider because most pass into breast milk. Emotional recovery includes distinguishing between postpartum blues and postpartum depression. Postpartum blues typically occur on days 3 to 7, with weepiness, emotional ups and downs, and a general feeling of letdown. These usually resolve with support and rest. If symptoms are prolonged or appear later, postpartum depression should be considered. Urinary incontinence after birth can be improved with Kegel exercises. These involve tightening the pubococcygeal muscles for a count of 3, relaxing, and repeating 10 times for 3 sets daily. Avoiding caffeine and diuretics can also help. Sexual activity should be resumed only after the episiotomy has healed and lochia has stopped, usually around 3 to 4 weeks postpartum. It is normal for couples to worry about discomfort, experience fatigue, or have concerns about milk leakage. Contraception should be discussed since breastfeeding is not a reliable form of birth control, and many oral contraceptives are not recommended during breastfeeding. Finally, parenting support includes assessing knowledge of child growth and development, family structure and dynamics, cultural background, available resources, supports, prior experiences, and the parent's communication styles, expectations, and motivation. Nursing diagnoses may include risk for impaired parenting or readiness for enhanced knowledge, family processes, or parenting. Interventions include setting realistic expectations based on developmental stage, giving anticipatory guidance, teaching about routine healthcare like immunizations and well child visits, monitoring stress, encouraging parental participation, and providing support as needed.